how are you doing? Why, Ann, it's you. I didn't expect to see you here.
It's nice to hear from you.
Funny I should run into you on Blogging Heads TV. How are you doing?
I'm good, and I should say that I'm Ann Althouse, and you're?
I am Dan Drezner.
Hi, Dan.
Hi, good to see you. How are things going? I see this is your second video post today. Is this correct? Or video experience on the blog?
Oh, yeah. I was getting my photograph taken for some, brochure or something like that. So I just did a little blog, in the office.
Yes, it was very meta. I saw the blog.
Yeah, it was like photographing the photographer.
Right, exactly.
Photographing the photographer. That counts for something, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. Well,
but this is the first time I've ever done Blogging Heads in the home set.
Oh.
So this is like a weird introduction of the world into my home space. Even though I podcast from here, I've never, well, I maybe have done a little vlog, but I've never really done a long thing like this in the home set. So
I'm the reverse.
And also doing it at night is weird to me.
See, all these things are the reverse for me. I'm used to doing it at home. I've never done the video blog at the office, and so this is more my natural métier. But
yeah, maybe seeing the bloggers in their natural habitat is pretty exciting.
I would imagine so. Although in my case, my background is pretty dull. Although I've moved it excitingly. You normally, if you've seen previous vlogs, you normally see my my bookshelf behind me. I have, however, moved to a comfy chair, so I'm much more comfortable in this, which is the important thing.
Well, I have a pretty exciting background, I think.
Oh, okay.
A mysterious background.
Oh.
Maybe, actually.
Why, are you set up for Halloween at home?
No.
Oh.
No, just in my little space here.
Ah.
You'll see.
Well, speaking of scary, I suppose we should talk about the events of the day, as it were. One of which is that the UN has continued to be deadlocked over who is going to be the Latin American representative on the UN Security Council.
Right.
Well, there are two contenders. One is Guatemala, which has been backed by the United States, and the other is Venezuela, which is backed by Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela. There have been, I think, 35 rounds of voting now. In one of the votes they tied. Besides that, generally Guatemala has been getting between, up to about 110, 112 votes. Venezuela is in the low 80s, high 70s. You need 2/3, so it's clear that neither of them is going to get it probably unless one, and so there's probably going to be a compromise candidate. But you never know, this sort of thing can last forever. The interesting thing is, Chavez has invested a great deal of effort over the last couple of years to try to get a seat on the UN Security Council, so he can combat the devil, as he put it.
Right, the devil.
In his September address to the UN General Assembly. And
so what is he? He's been going around making like oil deals or something like that?
There's an oil deal here, an airstrip there, aid money here, improving a hospital occasionally there, massive. And then of course, this is, sort of all the rhetoric.
And yet he's doing very badly in this effort.
Well, and what's interesting is that this is part of a trend with Chavez, which is it's almost like everything he touches turns to dust and crumbles. This same week, there was a first round of elections in Ecuador, and the Chavez-backed candidate, which everyone assumed was the question before the election was going to be not whether he was going to win, but whether he was going to win outright in the first round or whether he was going to be forced to a second round of voting. Well, not only has he been forced to a second round of voting, he actually came in second, way below expectations, to a conservative free market billionaire in Ecuador. And furthermore, the candidate that Chavez backed in the Mexican elections, Manuel López Obrador, recently suffered a setback as well. Not only has he lost the presidential election after there was contested voting, he actually...
So he's the touch of death.
Yeah.
Why is this happening?
I think, Chavez is one of those people that... he would be better off if he shut up. In some ways, I think as, an American, I want him to talk as much as possible. A lot of the reports indicate that really one of the things that cost him dearly in the UN General Assembly vote was the fact that he gave that September speech where he went way over the top and said, I can still smell the devil sitting here, I can still smell the sulfur, so on and so forth.
So that makes it seem like the UN isn't as crazy and anti-American as we're normally led to think. Right?
Well, you know what? The UN actually, believe it or not, cares about diplomacy. There are, believe it or not, diplomatic norms out there. And, Chavez saying something like, we can smell the sulfur, yeah, it makes for riveting television. But, even those delegates who might not necessarily be thrilled with the U.S. policies, they think it's rude. And it's counterproductive. And understandably, there's questions of if you get Venezuela on the Security Council, it's going to make life more difficult, not just for the United States, but for pretty much everyone else. Take, for example, the most recent Security Council resolution against North Korea. Mm-hmm. Now, you can debate about whether or not the sanctions were, stringent enough or what have you, but the fact is it was a 15-0 vote, and that does count for something. That's significant. The fact that you've got a unanimous vote. If Venezuela had been on the Security Council, they likely would have dissented, and that would have undercut the consensus a little bit. And so the fact is that even those who don't necessarily like the United States, do want the UN to function at some level. And right. You have to have the United States in the United Nations for it to function. And so, having Venezuela on board isn't necessarily, at least on the Security Council, isn't necessarily the best move. There are other countries out there that can probably, not necessarily oppose the United States, but certainly disagree with the United States and do it in a much more clever and potentially productive way.
Yeah. Well, it's impressive to me that the UN doesn't sort of cave to a kind of a fit of pique and want to express some kind of an anti-American sentiment, even though it's not practical. I would have thought that people would be more likely to give in and get some sort of expression out of this, and that Chavez would actually attract more supporters than he has. So he's encouraging, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. On the other hand, I think what's interesting is who he has attracted in terms of support. He's got, Russia and China have basically backed Chavez, and most of the Arab states have backed him as well. Most of his OPEC allies. Mm-hmm. He's got about half of Latin America. But besides that, not so much, no. And this actually reveals one of the other sort of facts about Chavez, which is he's obviously been, a big booster of OPEC, and the fact that he wants to see high oil prices because he thinks it's a way to bring America to its knees. This overlooks a relatively important fact, which is high oil prices. Certainly make life inconvenient for the United States. They make life really, really painful for the rest of the developing world that doesn't export oil. That in fact, high oil prices or high energy prices more generally are a guaranteed way to impoverish a lot of the developing world. So it's not shocking me, for example, probably that most of the African nations I tend to doubt are voting for him because, they see Chavez and they see someone who wants higher oil prices.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Yeah. But yes, it's nice to see, that I agree that it's interesting to see that the General Assembly is not necessarily always going to, vote for the Zionism as racism.
Yeah, I thought we were more hated than that, and that voting for him would be a way of expressing hate.
It's possible
maybe
that
expressing oneself isn't as popular as it seems to be.
Well, I think this also distinguishes the General Assembly from the Security Council, this is one of the few votes the General Assembly has that actually matters, because the Security Council is the institution, of the UN bodies that actually has any kind of weight. And while I think members of the General Assembly are perfectly happy to, vote resolutions that might be meaningless and blast the United States, they're not necessarily going to want to vote on a meaningful one that blasts the United States. And so, there are ways in which the UN, even the UN, sort of cottons to reality in this sense. And yeah, I agree with you that it's encouraging that Chavez, much less get 2/3, can't even muster a majority of votes, despite the wildly over-the-top rhetoric.
Yeah, I was just looking at a Boston Herald editorial on it saying Chavez and the politics of hate are already losers.
Well, again, it's stunning the extent to which everything Chavez touches seems to turn to dust. Beyond Ecuador, the Peruvian election before that, the Mexican election before that, his attempts to interfere, or not interfere, but influence elections across Latin America don't seem to be working terribly well. And he's put a lot of capital into the idea that Venezuela was going to get a Security Council seat. So one of the interesting implications about this is that the Venezuelan opposition has actually rallied behind or agreed upon a challenger to Chavez in the December elections. And whether or not he actually faces, a real electoral threat will be fascinating. But, the interesting question is going to be whether or not I think, Chavez lives and learns to some extent. And actually decides to keep his mouth shut from now on. My guess is that he's just got poor impulse control, and that's never going to happen.
He seems to be a real character. It's hard to see him changing into a serious, responsible type leader.
Well, the only thing that concerns me is, I tend to agree, although on the other hand, you never know. Someone like Ahmadinejad in Iran looks equally in some ways foolish, except, of course, for the possibility that he might have nuclear weapons. So, and same with Kim Jong-il. I think Jon Stewart this week or last sort of described him as like an elderly 60s woman who's just left a shopping mall. And it's true, he's sort of a cartoonish figure. I mean, as anyone who's seen Team America World Police knows, but the problem is that he's got a bomb, and so as a result, suddenly he seems...
That makes you look serious.
Yes, exactly. So I think, potentially the only way that Chavez can rescue his dignity is to acquire a nuclear weapon, and hopefully he won't be watching Blogging Heads TV and taking that advice.
Don't give him any ideas.
I'm sorry, but, I'm sure others will have thought of the idea.
Can I drag up the new topic?
Yes, please do.
We were going to talk about universities and free speech. I don't know where you wanted to start there, but I was thinking this subject of Jim Gilchrist at Columbia University.
Well, there's a number of things going on. I think the Gilchrist episode is certainly one. Yes, why don't you summarize for us what's happening?
And we have to tell the people what we're talking about.
Right, Jim Gilchrist is one of the leaders of the Minutemen, which is a militia that guards, ostensibly tries to guard the U.S.-Mexican border. He gave a speech at Columbia, or was trying to give a speech at Columbia, sort of articulate positions.
Word, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I think he maybe got one word out before his opponents
right, he got a couple,
rushed the stage.
Exactly, as I think one of the daughters of one of the bloggers at Powerline videoed the disruption, and it was very clear that Gilchrist was about to speak, and then suddenly a whole number of protesters, rampage onto the stage, get their banner out, which I don't remember what it said. A couple of them got very close to Gilchrist. It was just general chaos and mayhem.
No, I was very interested in this sort of blog post that Stanley Fish had in the New York Times about that. It was in the Times Select, so I don't know if not everybody could have seen
Shockingly,
that.
not everyone get time. There's some protesters to Times Select, even as a concept. But why don't you summarize what Fish said?
Well, he said, I'll just read a little bit of it. Any education that might have transpired had Mr. Gilchrist been allowed to give his talk would have been incidental to the shock value of his appearance before an audience known in advance to be hostile to his message. That was why he was invited, not to impart instruction, but to provoke a response, and it is the response rather than the content that is always focused on in media reports. Although in this instance, those who brought him to the campus got more than they bargained for. Basically, his idea is that, it was all theater. The whole thing was set up to be theater. It wasn't really a lecture. The idea that they didn't let him speak, that's all very bogus because it wasn't a real lecture. The whole thing was staged to be kind of a demonstration, and everything was really to be expected. So, it doesn't deserve to be judged by these sort of old-fashioned standards of whether there's an actual debate that airs all the issues and things like that. It's just, as he put it, did it rock? Was it a blast?
Right.
Was a good time had by all?
And if I remember correctly, Fish in that same post also has, he has this sharp divide between the entertainment value of this sort of thing as opposed to sort of straight curricular, if this had been done in a classroom, he says that would have been appropriate.
Right.
Which
he calls a lot of attention to the distinction between curricular and extracurricular activities. And as I wrote on my blog, the norms of the classroom this is me just summarizing it, the norms of the classroom do not apply, even on campus, outside the classroom. And I was very interested in that because we have various groups on campus and the Dean of Students' Office who are trying to get more respectful speech, as if the sort of norms of the classroom really should prevail everywhere on campus, that no one should ever feel disrespected, or there shouldn't be any sort of aggressive, mean speech, and everything should be nice all the time. And I really think that Fish had a good point here, that it's one thing to be in the classroom, and a certain kind of decorum in the classroom, a certain kind of demand for reasoned speech is appropriate in the classroom, but outside the classroom, maybe you really want a sort of a wilder environment where people can yell at each other and there can be physical demonstrations. I mean, no one should be hitting anyone. But other than that, maybe we should really lean toward not being repressive at all here.
I don't know. I disagree a little bit. I mean, I think Fish's distinction between sort of, he's got this very sharp dichotomy between, the purpose of a curriculum as opposed to the entertainment value of everything that's outside the class. And, which makes me wonder if Fish has really been to a university.
Well, yes.
I'm sure he has, but, the fact is that, at any university there are, classes, there are also talks that are clearly designed, not just to shock, but presumably to inform. I don't think...
Yeah, but which category do you think this one was in? This Minuteman guy? I mean, he's not like a big intellectual that's going to explain complex ideas.
No, he's not, but at the same time, presumably, one of the points of having him come to the university is precisely because people at Columbia aren't going to be ordinarily exposed to the ideas that,
Right.
and, you can say the ideas might be primitive, you can say the ideas might be racist, you can say the ideas might be simple-minded. But he has a point of view, and it's a point of view that's held by a large number of people. This is not just some sort of, neo-Nazi out there. I mean, clearly, there's a large number of people that presumably sympathize with the Minutemen based in the southwest United States. So, maybe it would be good to actually have him articulate that point of view, without trying to disrupt it.
I agree with that. But I think if the point is, it's acceptable for the students to have banners, to maybe do a little heckling, and a sort of a moderate version of the disorganized speech might be good. And then you could say, well, these students went too far, and maybe you could blame security for not breaking it up and calming it down more quickly. But so the students went too far. You might still want to say that they should be punished too much. They're shamed a little, maybe do a little something, but the idea that they should be expelled, and I think there's a lot of overstated punitive attitude.
I completely agree with that. There's no way that the student should be expelled for this sort of activity.
I mean, in fact, I'm out here in the University of Wisconsin, and I'm often surprised by how little student activity there is. We have this sort of central square at the University of Wisconsin, and I walk through it nearly every day, and I just feel like, where are all the student speeches? Where's the kind of raucous activity? I don't see it. And I went to the University of Michigan back during the Vietnam era.
Well, Ann, now come on, that's that's an exceptional. I mean, the University of Michigan is still that way, I would argue.
University of Wisconsin was that way back in the Vietnam era. I mean, I'm not just saying, why aren't these young kids today more like we were, but I'm just amazed at how sort of muted everything is. And I think a lot of the students have kind of just withdrawn from politics and just felt like, they don't feel that vigorous speech is really encouraged.
So in other words, what you're saying is that, the emphasis on sort of polite speech acts as too much of a barrier to entry, that in fact, it would be better to reward impolite speech, or to imply that if you make impolite speech, you're not going to be censured, you're not going to face retribution, you're not going to face anything like that.
The program we have on campus now is called Think, Respect, and thinking before you speak and respecting, that all sounds very nice, but it's sort of like, at some point it's just too repressive, and everyone feels like, well, the norm has become to be so nice to everyone that you just don't even dare to talk about any of the rich topics that you really should want to talk about on campus. All the things that people can get mad about and can feel like yelling about. Everybody just feels like, well, maybe we should, I don't know, I'm characterizing what students think, and some of it is my own impression in the classroom, but there's an idea that you don't want to offend anyone, and therefore maybe we won't talk about politics at all. So I think you need to make the campus safe for vigorous debate and to encourage students to talk about the hot topics, which I don't think they're encouraged to talk about now. They're more encouraged to just be nice and polite. Boy, back when I went to college, the idea that you were going to be a polite young student was just one of the things that we got mad and yelled about.
No, this is a fair point. I mean, look, I'm a strict Millian when it comes to this sort of thing, which is, my belief is always that the ills of speech are generally cured by encouraging more speech, not restricting it in the first place. I mean, at the same time, this raises some interesting questions, though. I mean, on one hand, I agree with you that potentially, programs that emphasize, please respect what, you must, show the utmost respect towards your debating opponents or what have you, can potentially impose barriers to people saying what they want. At the same time, the Gilchrist episode also suggests that, but there should be at least certain minimal rules so that you can actually have a conversation as opposed to just people shouting just for the sake of shouting, because then I'm not sure that's terribly, productive either. And then, to go back to Fish's point, it might be valid that there's, the interesting question is, do you think there are certain kinds of speech that are perfectly permissible not in the classroom, that should be perhaps encouraged in these other fora, but in the classroom would be so, volatile or so almost disruptive that...
Like name-calling and yelling.
Yes, exactly.
But I think outside of the classroom, there should be a fair amount of name-calling and yelling. Young people should be cursing at each other some of the time. In my school, they're encouraging the students to file reports. You can go on the internet and get a form and fill out a form about, a bias incident is a threat or act of bigotry, harassment, or intimidation, verbal, written, or physical. And students can report anything from a hate crime to graffiti to verbal harassment. And they're asking for forms to be filed, and then investigations will be done. It's sort of like, well, if you curse at someone and tell them they're an idiot and with swear words around it for believing what they believe, then they could say, well, they're being disrespected, they're being intimidated or harassed because of what they believe. Political views is on the list of things that you could file a report if someone harasses you about that.
Well,
I think that creates a dangerous atmosphere where students who don't want to keep a clean record or don't want to get in trouble with the administration are just going to say, well, I won't talk to people that I don't agree with already, or I won't talk about politics.
Well, and this raises a couple of questions, it seems to me. The first is, I think one of the interesting things is how quickly Columbia reacted, for example, to what happened in the Gilchrist case. Lee Bollinger, who was the president of Columbia, gave, what I thought was a relatively appropriate response, condemning the students for what they did and yet at the same time not expelling them, which I thought was the appropriate response. You wonder if part of the reason the response was so swift and immediate was precisely because there was a video record of what actually happened, which leads me to wonder, again, if, YouTube is one of the ways in which you can actually have an appropriate check on when, arguments go so beyond the pale that, in fact, yes, you should.
And that's more speech.
Right, exactly. So, in other words, you don't necessarily need campus speech codes or doctrines about respect.
Right.
All you need, frankly, are people with more more people with video cameras.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, everybody's got the phones, and I always have a camera with me. I could take a video of anything, and I think YouTube is just great. I think, we're just beginning to see what that's like, and I think people didn't realize that at Columbia.
Right.
And now it's it reminds me a little, my old reminiscing about the Vietnam era, but it's sort of like in the convention of 1968 when the riots outside the Democratic Convention were on the news. And there was the whole world was watching, and then the police who were there doing what they did didn't seem to get the idea that it was all going to be on television for some reason. But now you don't even need to have big lights and news people there. Everybody's got a camera, and everything can end up on the internet. And it's really easy to get embarrassed. So this idea that you're in some cloistered environment where your side doesn't get criticized, it's not true anymore. There's always someone with a camera, and it'll be on YouTube later that day. The
second thing I think this brings up, and I think one of the reasons that you might be wary of these sorts of speech regulations, is that it deals with a sort of star chamber which scares the crap out of everyone, which is university sort of university complaint systems that are filed against individuals. I remember, I don't know if you remember, this was about a year or two ago, a professor named Scott Eric Kaufman posted a blog. It was a very amusing one about how he accidentally walked into his own office and caught two students, making the beast with two bats, to quote Shakespeare. And the students were really upset with him, but it was this sort of absurd thing, and it was just very, very funny.
And he mocked them on his blog.
Right, he mocked them on his blog, not naming names.
And they were completely ridiculous.
They were completely in the wrong. However, he then got contacted by his school administrator asking that, I'd like to talk to you about this episode, and refusing to explain why he wanted to talk about the episode. And Kaufman freaked for a while until he discovered, in fairness, that the administrator was like, do you want to press charges against them rather than vice versa? But I think the reason he was concerned, justifiably, is that we've all heard horror stories of, either faculty or students who are accused of this sort of, some sort of bias or some sort of hate speech or what have you, and they're not necessarily, as a law professor, you can tell me it's not clear what the due process is in a lot of these cases, where you don't necessarily face your accuser, where you don't know what the context of the situation is.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think somebody could decide they hate my blog, they don't like my politics or something like that. Then they could go over my blog and decide that things that I'm writing are harassing or create a hostile environment or something like that. And if they really wanted to try to put together some kind of a complaint against me, they could, there's like thousands and thousands, there's thousands of pages of writing that they could go over and, using search engines, find various things and make some kind of an argument about it. I know people got mad at me about some ridiculous thing I don't want to talk about a few weeks ago, and some of the people in the comments on other blogs where they were mad at me, started talking about things they could do to try to try to get me fired or try to get me in trouble at my university, something like that. So, you could get a real block swarm around you, and you could get people who really would try to put something together and make some kind of a charge against you and create all sorts of trouble.
Well,
Fortunately, at my university, there really is strong support for free speech, at least when the speech is by the faculty. I think one of the problems I have with this reporting system is that the way students are treated isn't really so nice, I think, because there's this idea that they want students, they have a positive idea there. They want the students to be in a good environment.
Well, yeah. But this is the age.
So they're really trying to create this sort of nice, respectful atmosphere. They don't want members of minority groups to feel that there's a bad atmosphere here, climate, or whatever. So I think that some efforts are made with students, but with respect to faculty, there really is strong support for free speech. I mean, we have this 9/11 conspiracy theorist teaching.
That's right. He's an adjunct. Yes.
A couple of political, yes, and various political figures, including the governor and the man who's running for
governor
at the opposing party. Both of them said that this teacher should be fired, and within the university there was a lot of support for him. There's a faculty organization that supports free speech, and there's a long tradition. So, in fact, I don't personally feel threatened, but I can see how people could think that they could put together some kind of a complaint, like a hostile environment kinds of charges.
Right.
And I think that would be terrible.
I mean, to be fair, I think the last point I'd make on this is that, in fairness to the university, this is an age-old issue, which is how does the university deal with its students? Do you treat them in part in a paternalistic way? To see them as relatively immature adults that need to learn how to behave in certain arenas, particularly political arenas, or do you treat them as fully formed individuals that should be responsible for their own actions? And let's face it, given the age, this is one. This is a very tough tightrope to walk.
Yeah. Back when I went to college, the students all thought we knew better and knew how they ought to act. We were trying to tell them what they needed to do. The idea that the administration was going to coddle and treat us like a bunch of children and tell us how to behave, that would have just flipped us out, and we would have protested all the more. So I think they should be treated like responsible adults, and
I tend to agree. Yes,
to that standard.
That's true.
So, you want to talk about virtual reality?
Yes, I do.
Is this Second Life? Have you ever gone inside Second Life?
I have.
And I guess the news this week was that Reuters is putting a technology reporter, like establishing a news bureau,
right,
inside a virtual reality game that's online.
My understanding is that CNET is doing this as well.
Which is the other one?
CNET. CNET, which is a website, or it's a news service devoted to technology news.
But inside.
Well, there's a
foreign country.
There's a whole bunch of interesting things happening right now in the virtual world. First, let me preface this by saying, and I'm going to apologize to all those people who play Second Life or World of Warcraft or any of these others, which is I've never done one of these, so I'm sure I'm going to be really ignorant about this. Apparently, though, there's a lot of gold farming that goes on. I do know that.
There's a lot of, I'm sorry.
Gold farming. Part of one of these, I think it's World of Warcraft, one of the quests that is important is you want to try to amass a lot of gold.
Okay.
But there's there's two interesting things that are going on.
You don't actually win any money that is real money, do you?
Well, this is the very interesting question. I'm glad you asked that. In the context of the game, no, not necessarily. However, there are so many attributes that are valuable in the game that what you're seeing are markets emerge, such that you can actually buy, gold or other, objects from other people. And in theory, you would pay only in virtual currency, but there are actual exchanges such that, on eBay, you can list these items and pay in real currency. And furthermore,
seems awfully lame.
Well,
what kind of a player would buy things they were supposed to win? Isn't that kind of cheating?
Not necessarily, because it's just a question of achieving the quest. I don't think it's so much you're buying the goal; you're just buying the means to which to achieve that goal.
Wait a minute, you said quest.
Yes.
So in this virtual reality life, people go on quests?
Yes.
Because that sounds really nerdy.
As I said, it's virtual reality, Anne. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that assertion.
So who are these people?
Are
they all...
A lot of them are apparently Koreans, is my understanding, at least based in Korea. But, I mean, it's very popular in Asia. But that said, this is a thriving environment. There are approximately 4 million people who engage, is my understanding, in this sort of virtual reality. And what's happening is there's a whole different, whole series of phenomena happening. First of all, you're starting to see corporations getting involved in virtual reality, which is they're actually setting up advertising venues inside, in these virtual worlds. There was a story in the New York Times today about this, such that Nissan or BMG Music Club, so on and so forth, and they're now beginning to see these virtual worlds as really test areas for marketing campaigns that they can then run in the real world. The second thing that's going on is that the IRS is now getting interested in these virtual worlds, precisely because in some cases the virtual commodities can be exchanged for real currency. Which is in Second Life, I think, and in World of Warcraft, there is a market. There are currencies, virtual currencies, and they actually have an exchange rate with real currency. So as a result, it is possible for prowess in the virtual world to be translated into income in the real world. And so the question is, should these virtual markets be taxed? And the IRS, an economist who works for the IRS, is speculated about this possibility. Today, the Joint Economic Committee, which is both a House Senate committee, sort of fired a warning shot in return, saying, "Well, let's not, jump the gun here. I'm not really sure this is necessary." But this is one of those situations where suddenly a whole lot of events about virtual reality are making it very obvious to everyone who does not play Second Life or World of Warcraft that this is yet another sort of world out there beyond just sort of conventional cyberspace like the blogosphere that is just sucking up the attention of a fair number of people.
Well, I certainly know what it's like to get absorbed into the blogosphere just looking at writing. So I guess if there was a whole visual world and you were interacting with all of these people, it might become just completely fascinating.
Well, some people claim this is the next evolution of the internet. That that sort of there's some acronym, MMPORG, I think, which I don't know what it stands for, but I'm guessing it's multiplayer, basically online interactive games. That this is the next generation of the internet, that rather than just sort of reading text passively on a screen, you're going to see more and more people, just basically adopting what's called an avatar or a personality in the virtual world, and that's how they're going to, interact in cyberspace. They're going to, create an entirely new virtual world.
Years ago, people would say, "Oh, writing is going to. People aren't going to have to read in the future. People aren't going to have to write." And then when the internet came out, and everyone was blogging and so forth, it seemed like, hey, that was all wrong. In fact, writing is really important, and understanding language and reading are suddenly extremely important skills.
Right.
But from what you're saying, it seems like maybe this is just a temporary phase, and pictures and sound will actually supersede all of this.
Yes, she said, on the video blog that we're about to post to Blogging Heads TV.
Right.
So, I think we're certainly aiding and abetting this trend. I mean, I think what I find interesting about this is, in some ways, what's going on in virtual reality now is, I think, a replay, potentially, of what's happening in the blogosphere. When blogs first emerged as a new sort of form of expression, there was a lot of enthusiasm about, this is, such a nice community, and, everyone's going to, it's an improvement over the mainstream media, and, there's this whole sort of network, and there's a way in which you can link across each other, and this is all very, very good. And then two things happened. The first thing is massive amounts of partisanship entered the blogosphere. And the second thing is corporations started entering the blogosphere, which is suddenly a lot of these mainstream media outlets co-opted a lot of bloggers. And that's, still continuing to this day. So as a result, it's not so much that it was this new, on the one hand, I think there are elements of optimism that people had about this early stages of the blogosphere that have sustained themselves. On the other hand, there are certain fundamental facts of life that can't, that you can't escape. One of which is people are going to have different political ideologies. Another which is there are going to be large corporations. And I think what's going to be interesting is to see how these virtual people who sort of inhabit a lot of these virtual worlds react to the fact that Sony, BMG, or other corporations are going to enter them. I was wondering, on my blog, are you going to start seeing virtual anti-globalization protests? Which, since a lot of these people can fly, would be really interesting, frankly. Or whether there will be a virtual university. Could I become a virtual endowed professor, of the global political economy or some other set? You could become a professor of virtual law. In other words, whether or not you're going to see, the real world or the things that make the real world occasionally irritating enter virtual reality?
Well, in blogging, there's a whole fight between people who see blogging as sort of play. I mean, I'm sort of in the play area,
right.
Even though I'll write serious things about law and politics. To me, I'm just completely absorbed in blogging as a kind of an art form or as a form of play, as something that is very engrossing. And I mean, I like to make some money on my ads or in various other ways, and I might support a candidate here and there, but I'm not there to push to try to make money overall. I'm going to write what I want to write, and I don't try to push various candidates, and I wouldn't let some political candidates wrangle me, and I won't be co-opted into that. That's really important, but it seems like there's like this counter.
But there's also Project Runway, which I know you're very, very interested in.
Do you like Project Runway?
I don't actually, no. I know it's supposed to be a very good show, but my obsession is Veronica Mars.
Oh, so you don't have any opinion on whether it was right that Jeffrey beat Uli?
I don't even know who they are.
You don't even know what I'm talking
No,
about?
I assume it was the finale, but no, got no opinion whatsoever.
Jeffrey is the guy that has the big tattoo all over his neck, and it's sort of like from the very beginning, it's like, oh, what's with that guy with the tattoo on his neck? How can he have that tattoo on his neck? And then gradually he he was doing well, and in the end he won. So.
I have to tell you, the last time I cared about a reality show involved Puck on MTV, so this might date me.
That was great.
Yes, exactly.
But speaking of virtual reality
right.
and reality shows, there's some kind of a link there. I mean, I personally find, having been really absorbed in the internet, that I almost never go to the movies, and I hardly watch any television at all, and I don't watch the sort of fictional story shows. I'll just watch a couple of reality shows, and it's not that I think they're that good, but I feel like the internet has done something to my mind that makes me prefer reality shows or something like that. And there's some way in which the whole internet is like a reality show, and you feel like you can participate in it, or you can move into some reality game. And maybe there's some connection between the popularity of reality shows and this Second Life virtual reality thing.
Maybe, although I have the opposite I think I've had the opposite reaction to blogging. I mean, blogging, to me, you're right, it does have aspects of a reality show. So, as a result, I find it much more interesting than watching other people participate in a reality show. The television I tend to watch...
Do you get absorbed in the fact that you can kind of keep score in blogging by checking your site meter and seeing what the numbers are and seeing different kinds of rankings and things like that? So, I mean, you can sort of play blogging like a game.
Maybe. No, it's true. This is actually something I've wrestled long and hard with, which is, try to control the number of times I check traffic, or,
it can feel a little crazy some of the time. I mean, part of the time you feel like you're really expressing yourself, but then there are other times when it's sort of like, why am I looking at this long, and why am I staring at these graphs and numbers as if I think I'm playing a game that I can win.
Well, or the other possibility is that some people take this very seriously. That they want the traffic, or they want the right kind of traffic, or they I think it raises an interesting question about the blogosphere, the future of the blogosphere. I think we can switch to Stephen Bainbridge.
Yeah, we wanted to talk about Stephen.
Right,
Bainbridge.
Stephen Bainbridge, recently, who is a law professor, I believe at UCLA. Generally an expert in business law and has some economics training as well. Recently posted that he was going to rebrand his blog, that he was getting sick of sort of general punditry and wanted to sort of focus much more on sort of niche of what he knows, his expertise, which is business law, presumably in economics. And this provoked a fair number of some reaction across the blogosphere. James Joyner at Outside the Beltway had reactions. Stephen Taylor had reaction. Both you and I posted on this.
What are some of the reactions you've been reading?
I mean, I think most of the reactions to people, understandably, the ones who probably disagree with how Bainbridge is going about this, which is the belief that you somehow have to have a niche. And it's interesting. I think there are sort of two competing visions of the blogosphere out there, and it depends on which one you're a part of. On the one hand, it was Adam Smith who said the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Well, you could argue the same thing might be true of the blogosphere. The larger the blogosphere is, the more incentive there might be to sort of only blog about what you know. If you want to be thought of, if you want to take the blog very seriously, and by that I mean, you want the blog to be seen as I guess, thoroughly respectable, seen as a source of expertise on something, then presumably you're going to narrow what you're going to talk about so that it's limited to the area that you're an expert on. In which case it becomes an adjunct to what you actually do in terms of your job.
Yeah.
Then
I'm against that position.
Right. Well, then I suspect there are people like you and me who started the blog because they, I started my blog in part because I thought I had expertise that I could share with others, on international relations more generally. But, for me, one of the things that hooked me on blogging in the first place, both reading and writing, is the fact that I can post about any friggin' thing I want to.
Right.
On the one hand, I can post about, the ramifications of North Korea exploding a nuclear weapon. And, then I can post about Mel Gibson, and how he's...
I love that.
Exactly. How he's doing exactly what I predicted
And since you have to post so much, you have to be there as a presence with replenishing the posts all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you just keep saying the same things about your scholarship, you're just not going to have a readership. You have to keep it alive by having just some way to refresh it.
Well, this is Bruce Bartlett made this point, I think, in a comment that he wrote into Bainbridge, where he said that a lot of the substantive blogs that he used to pay attention to, he doesn't anymore because he thinks there's... And he's actually emailed this to me in the past as well, where Bruce's theory is that you come into blogging with a certain stock of knowledge that you've acquired, as a scholar. The problem is that as you start blogging, you expel that knowledge. You sort of basically, you eventually lay out what your beliefs are on a whole variety of topics. And then the problem is you wind up, potentially repeating yourself ad nauseum because you don't acquire any new knowledge.
Yeah, it's not a blog.
Right.
I mean, it's more like, why not just have a website where you have all your basic information in some other ordered fashion? Why are you doing it in a blog form?
Yeah, although, I think what Bruce gets wrong about this is... it's the perception, perhaps, that people spend too much time blogging. I mean, I'm acquiring new substantive knowledge as I'm blogging, potentially. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I actually think the work, the knowledge transfer works, it cuts both ways. I've actually written scholarly articles that started off as sort of blog posts.
Right.
I've got a paper on whether or not the American public actually thinks in a sort of realist or liberal ways about foreign policy. That started off as a blog post, as a reaction to other people blogging about something.
No, that's great.
Yeah. Partially, there's that going on. But the other thing is that if I only could blog, if I chose only to blog about, the politics of the global economy or something like that, I think I'd probably kill the blog or myself within a week. It would be...
Yeah.
Because that's not all that I do. I mean, certainly, it's not to say I don't want to blog about those things. I do, but I also want to be able to blog about, the midterm elections, Salma Hayek, the rest.
You have to create some kind of a flow. You have to dilute the serious and the light. I mean, it's kind of a mysterious whole, and you have to have a feeling for it.
Well, this raises, again, I think you're right. So my reaction to Bainbridge deciding that he wants to rebrand his blog, I wish him good luck, because I think, if that's what he wants to do, far be it for anyone else to say he shouldn't do it. I think my brand, however, is precisely going to be one that's going to be idiosyncratic to myself. And probably a lot of people won't like it. I'm not going to generate the traffic that many big bloggers get, but, I get enough traffic, and I'm perfectly content with that.
Well, I get a pretty lot of traffic.
I think your traffic is actually probably larger than mine, but...
Yeah, I get about 12,000 visitors a day.
That's definitely larger than mine.
And I do it, and some people will... I put up with criticism where people will say, I can't believe this woman is a law professor and that she writes that, and what an idiot, and it's sort of like... Because they don't see that I'm being humorous, or that they don't understand the meaning of the light things. It's sort of like they can understand the heavy, serious stuff, but if you put something light, or you put something nonsensical...
Frivolous, yeah.
Yeah, frivolous. They just think, well, then how can you be a law professor? You get back in your law professor box, but the fact is that you actually build a readership of people who want to read you all the time because you've made it surprising, and because you've done idiosyncratic things that make people have a sense that you're not just a law professor,
right,
but you're a specific person with a set of things that that keep varying, but certain themes come back, and it's like, oh, Althouse is talking about squirrels again, or something like that, I just think that makes people bond with you, and that creates a readership, so that if you actually do write on one of your scholarly topics, mm-hmm, you've got people there to read it, and if something comes out, like let's say a new Supreme Court case comes out, there'll be people there reading what I say about it rather than going to some blog that they never go to because that one has stuck to Supreme Court cases the whole time.
No, this raises a valid point, and it's one of the things I like to think that, potentially I get from my blogging, which is precisely because I've got a larger readership than I would have if I only posted about, the global political economy. I actually, when I do talk about substantive issues, so I'm slipping them the spinach even though they don't know it, which is I'm going to have people read the blog no matter what. People who are going to read the blog no matter what are actually going to read about things that they otherwise would not be exposed to. Which I think
people come for different things.
Exactly. And so again, that's part of I think the fun of being a blogger.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be an interesting evolution over time about whether or not the sort of demand aspects of blogs, which is people who really want to acquire traffic or acquire a brand, butt up against those people who are blogging for their own reasons, not because they want traffic, not because they want...
Well, I think the brand is you, and you need to come across somehow as a person that people want to check in with every day. And maybe you can't do that, or maybe that's threatening, or you just don't want to expose yourself, or whatever. But I think that's the better way to blog, and it has more to do with the blog, what the blog form itself actually is, which is constant updating.
I will say there's one caveat, and this I say this as a professor, which is there are times, I actually gave a convocation address about this at Indiana University Northwest with Esther Hargitay, and I did say that one downside about this as a professor is that, there's an aspect of the professor-student relationship such that you wonder if part of the problem with the blog is that because I know that occasionally my students read it, it does occasionally make me a little more self-conscious because there are things I don't necessarily want my students to know, or there are things that I don't necessarily want my students to read and think about when I'm professor. Yeah. And so the question is whether, you can keep those identities separate or not. I always start off...
Do you find that the students sort of reach over the line and treat you as, Dan the blogger instead of Professor Drezner? Don't they adopt the classroom persona and interact with you as the professor rather than cross the line and act like, we know you, the blogger guy? Don't they hold that line? I find my students do.
It's tough to say. Having just moved universities, having started Fletcher, so far I would say the answer is yes, certainly here. My experience is that what usually happens is that there is a certain category, there's a certain percentage of students, and it's not a large percentage, but it's a significant one, that when they first meet me in a classroom, still think of me as the blogger, because that's how they originally got to know me.
Now, how do you know that? Because I can't
they'll come
tell
up to see me and say, Professor Drezner, your blog is awesome.
Oh.
I've gotten that.
I don't get that, but I think it's partly because maybe they're pissed off at me for my politics, and I have a feeling that maybe a lot of the students are like, I can't believe she voted for Bush, I can't stand that, or so. So I kind of think my blogger personality is something that they feel like a little averse to. It's sort of like, Althouse is right-wing. I don't consider myself right-wing, but I feel like when I show up at the University of Wisconsin Law School with
you're right-wing,
a pretty liberal lefty place, that it's like, there's that. That's a right-wing professor. I feel like there's some of that. Not that it's personal, intimate, but it's like this sort of stigma of being right-wing.
No, my experience has always been, for the last couple of years now, every first day of class, I'll inevitably have, a couple students come up to me and say, by the way, I love the blog. And it took me a long time to figure out how to deal with that. To be fair, in some cases, the people who come up to me usually will say it in terms of admiration. What concerns me are the students who don't talk to me about it, and whether or not it affects how they think about me, I guess, and whether it's somehow seen as it makes me less professional. Now, my suspicion is not. But it's a concern that I have, and I don't think it's a concern that...
Well, I think it probably is a little weird for them.
Yeah.
And they probably feel like they're intimate with you because they're readers, but then they're kind of not. And
right.
So that there's something a little confusing about it. And I've often thought about how, I have comments on the blog, and the people come in with pseudonyms.
Yeah.
And I figure, well, some of them probably are students, and then that allows them to come in and interact with me in a way that they can't in real life, and talk to me in a way that, and I'll talk back to them in a way that we would never do if we were identifiably professor and student. So really any student, well, they might worry that they'll be found out or so they might not do it. But I assume that some of those pseudonyms are actually my students. and that it must be kind of a weird thing to be able to do, to come in and talk to me in this outside of the professor-student relationship kind of a way.
And I think that might be one of the issues, which is occasionally, as a blogger, you are seen as more accessible, and so, potentially, you're right that students can treat you in your blog persona in a way different than if they treat you as your professor persona.
Because I would never, there's certain ways I would never talk to a student that I would talk to a commenter, like being sharply critical, or even sometimes calling them a loser or an idiot. If they're abusive to me,
see, I don't
normally name call, but I might.
I don't know. I call students losers and idiots all the time, man. I mean, really,
call the students in class losers and idiots?
No, I don't. It was a joke.
But commenters, I would, not normally. But if they're ridiculous to me, I'll take off the gloves myself. And I sometimes used to feel like, well, since I'm a law professor, I have to always have this certain demeanor.
Yeah.
And then they can come in and abuse me, and I have to keep acting like a law professor. And I've sort of over time developed a way that I feel like I can act that is not really appropriate for a law professor in the building. But, in my little space, I feel like I can. I've decided to give myself permission to talk like that.
Well, in this way, I think the blogosphere does have, connections to virtual reality, I guess, and that, there are different personas, in your day job as opposed to, what you do as a blogger. I mean, as I said, for me, it's a level of discomfort, and I think it's slowly, it's subsided a little bit. I don't think it will ever go away, actually, at least until I stop blogging or stop teaching, one of the two. Precisely because I think the conflict to some extent is irreducible. Unless, as we said before, unless your blog is so utterly professional, it's so only about your research and scholarship, inevitably there are going to be parts of your personality that are going to peek out that you would never let peek out in a lecture or in a seminar or anything like that. And so that, I think, is interesting, and I'm not sure... I certainly don't think we're going to resolve it in this
maybe
episode.
One reason to take the Bainbridge route, I'm not saying that this is why he did it, but one reason might be if you thought that there were aspects of yourself, like feelings of hostility or qualities about your personality that you felt actually would be damaging to your career if they showed, but you felt tempted to let show. That would be kind of a very risky, exciting situation to be in, and you might decide, like I probably would, okay, well, I'm just going to do everything in blogging and let the chips fall where they may. Or you might say, this is dangerous. I really can't do this. I might some night I'll be up late tapping things out and say some horrible things that will just ruin my reputation.
Well, I think this points out one of the potential risks, and also, a way in which scholar blogging can be really exciting.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have...
Well, we have one more topic. How late? Are we going over time? We were going to talk about the elections. I feel like I think we have a little more time.
We have a little more time.
Elections. Are you following them closely? Are you interested in them?
I'll tell you the truth. No. I know we're supposed to talk about this. I say this as a Republican. I have a rooting interest, I think, in the Democrats taking control of one chamber of Congress.
Wait, you're one of those Republicans who thinks it would be good for the Republicans if the Democrats won?
Yes.
Oh, because there's been a lot of talk about that lately.
That's true. For example...
okay, run with that. That's a good topic.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I recognize my party anymore, I guess would be the kind way of putting it.
So you're a long-term Republican.
I'm a long-term Republican. As I think the New York Times had an op-ed or a Week in Review section a while ago. I, registered as a Republican at age 18. When I grew up, my primary experience in terms of seeing Democrats was Jimmy Carter. My primary exposure to Republicans was Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. It seemed relatively clear to me which party I found more compelling. I liked the idea of a party that was relatively low tax, but also preached fiscal conservatism, that was willing to brand the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and yet still talk to them when they were willing to talk to us. This was the sort of, it seemed to me, the party of grown-ups. And I'm not sure it's the party of the grown-ups anymore, frankly. I'm not saying the Democrats are, but,
Yeah, I was always, the first election I voted in was 72, so you can picture how unattractive the Republicans seemed at that time. But, so I voted for Democrats all along, all the way up until, I voted for Bush in 04, but up until 04, I voted for all the Democrats. And I was always rooting for the Democrats. And, even in 04, I voted for Feingold. So.
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of right-winger I am.
Yeah, I was going to say. Well, in my case, I mean...
But people keep writing about me, oh, we know, she should just admit it. She's just...
No, in my case, I pretty much voted straight Republican. I mean, I was
wow.
Until 2004, I voted for Kerry then, although with great reat.
Well, you voted for Kerry.
I did vote for Kerry.
So you're the big Republican that voted for Kerry, and I'm the big
I'm
Democrat.
the one, yes, it's me.
But now you're saying that you want the Democrats to win, but you voted for Kerry, and now you're saying you want the Democrats to win. People are going to say they're going to question whether.
Well, I would say two things. First, I want the Democrats to win for two reasons. The first is I want my own party punished for sort of abandoning small government conservatism, and instead sort of embracing this huge government nanny state, which frankly I don't want any part of, because that was, funnily enough, what I thought the Democrats were all about. So, I want them punished for that. The second thing is, frankly, I'm a big fan of gridlock. I like the way it worked in the 80s and even in the 90s to some extent. It actually seemed to work well in terms of government. In the 90s you saw, moves towards fiscal rectitude. I kind of like those things. So I don't have a problem necessarily with another branch of government being controlled by a different party. This is not to say...
Are you worried about, unleashing all these pointless or whatever investigations?
The investigations?
I think just retaliation, and that things will be quite dysfunctional? Well, not that I don't...
I would say as opposed to the high level of functionality that's going on now, I mean, I'm not...
Right, that's what I was going to say, yeah.
First of all, again, it's compared to the status quo. Second, I think Bruce Bartlett, again, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, pointing out that the Democrats, they're not stupid. They're not going to suddenly decide to hold impeachment hearings or anything like that. There are going to be hearings about Iraq. I think there should be hearings about Iraq. I think that's entirely appropriate. That's people have complained about whether or not Congress actually functions as a watchdog. I think that's a perfectly justifiable duty of Congress.
I think it's justifiable to have investigations about Iraq, but I'm just afraid that if the Democrats conduct them, that there'll be bogus investigations that are all about political posturing, and it'll only make things worse.
Well, first, I'd be shocked if congressmen acted, politically postured in a hearing format.
So why do you want investigations?
Because, oddly enough, I guess I would take bogus hearings over no hearings. Because I don't think there are going to be hearings, in any circumstance with the Republicans still in charge. I'd rather see... This might be a case where partisanship actually works in the country's favor. Where even if the Democrats are shrill, even if they're over the top, and I don't know if they're going to be, but even if they are, it actually forces people, in the administration to defend their views, to articulate why they think what they're doing is the right thing to do.
Go ahead.
And to do so under a relatively aggressive questioning.
Now, it would also set up the presidential election in 2008.
That's
if
correct.
the Democrats come in and start doing whatever they decide to do, that's going to lay the foundation for however the presidential election is going to be played.
See, I don't think people are saying this, and I'm actually more skeptical of that. In part because most of the people, first of all, I think because most of the focus on the takeover, if the Democrats take over a chamber, it's far more likely to be the House than the Senate, and there are no presidential candidates coming from the House, so it's all from the Senate side.
So the House will just be this sort of somewhat aggressive institution, but it won't really have much effect on anything?
I think it'll have an effect, but the advantage of being a presidential candidate is that you can say whether or not you agree or disagree with what the House is doing. It's not like you necessarily have to have very strict party solidarity on this issue. So, it's going to be the case where, if Nancy Pelosi says one thing, it's not clear that, Hillary's, or Barack Obama, who might run, I don't know, or John McCain for that matter, is going to necessarily agree on everything. So, I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't think it's going to lay that much of a foundation. I don't think it's really going to. I mean, it'll affect the 2008 election.
In other words, if it's only in the House, there's going to be no serious candidates that are going to get involved in the disruption, and it might actually have a good it might actually have a good effect.
Now, if there's a change,
some kind of an outlet. I mean, I do think that the Democrats have just been suppressed for so long that it's just unbelievably frustrating for people who never get a chance to be in power. It's just horrible.
Well, but it hasn't been that long. I mean, it's only been 12 years now. And in fact, most of the committee chairmen, most of the Democrats who would take over as committee chairmen if there's a transfer of power, had been in committee chairman back in '94. So it hasn't. First of all, it hasn't been that long.
Well, for young people, it seems like it's been their whole.
Yes, for the young people, that's true.
The young people are getting a little disturbed at being on the outs for so long. Well, I'm acting like...
You mean, I would say you're assuming all young people are Democrats, which I'm not...
Well, there was an article in the Times over the weekend. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
The review about how the young people are skewing Democrat.
Right. Well, no, you're right, because it touched on why, among other reasons, I'm supposed to be a Republican, which is when I was young, that was the thing to do, apparently. All the hip kids were doing it. No, that's true. And, maybe one effect of a Democratic takeover here, and you might approve of this, is that if you have a Democratic takeover, young people will get more interested in politics, which means on campus they'll be more vocal, and they'll quit those virtual worlds.
They need to get out of that.
And get out of there and actually enter the real world, and try to engage, and live a political life.
But the idea that a Democratic House would be so inspiring to young people, I just think...
Ann, you're underestimating the effect that Nancy Pelosi can have on others.
She's just gonna wake them all up.
Exactly. Nancy Pelosi and Stern Hoyer are single-handedly going to improve, campus political life and the problem of geeks desperately obsessed with Second Life. I mean, I think we've had our grand unification theory of how to improve the ills of the world. This is the wonderful thing about video blogging. This never would have occurred to me.
All the themes pulled together, didn't they?
Exactly. We've managed to pull them all into one. Somehow we didn't fit Hugo Chavez. I don't know what will happen to him if there's a Democratic Congress.
I don't know. I think things really, the threads pulled together so well just then that we've got to seize this opportunity.
I think we should seize this opportunity to say goodnight, yes?
Should we say goodnight?
I think we should. Anne, it was lovely talking to you.
Yeah, it was great.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Good night.
Night.